Hey everybody, Dr. Dan, and this is week 9 in our American history class, and there is a quiz due this week on Sunday. This is probably my favorite chapter, although I think I said that about the last chapter. But this is a really cool time as far as American history goes when we're trying to relate the past to the present, and that's why I like this chapter so much. And I think understanding the concepts that we're talking about when we were discussing the formation of the Constitution, and we talked about Federalist and Anti-Federalist, the Federalist wanting, like big government and government intervention, and the Anti-Federalist wanting government that's hands off. And those two threads, those two thoughts or ideas, we see today. Now, the political parties in the U.S. have changed dozens of times as far as what they stand for. And this Federalist and Anti-Federalist time is really referred to as the beginnings of the first party system, or the first instance of partisan politics in the U.S. And so this chapter picks up on that. So the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, that was really during the constitutional age, which was only 3 or 4 years prior to this chapter. But now that we get into the 1800s, we see some realignments as far as politics goes. So really what historians refer to as the first party system is a system after the Constitution is ratified, where there still is a Federalist Party, but now the new party under Thomas Jefferson is called the Democratic Republicans, just to make it even more confusing. So this first party system consists of the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans, and the way we can relate all of this to today is because one side stands for an activist government, and the other side stands for, like total freedom and liberty and no regulations. And so if you look at politics today, generally speaking, the Republican Party of today is really for hands off. We don't want to regulate industry, we don't want to regulate polluters, and we don't want to over-regulate things because our indoctrination as a capitalist nation, capitalism and liberty to do whatever you want to do sort of run hand in hand. And then the whole notion of personal liberty implies freedom, and therefore that implies hands off. Government, don't make me pay for Obamacare, maybe would be one argument. So that's like the Republican Party today, and that's the way that the Democratic Republicans were under Thomas Jefferson in the 1800s, in this period of time we're talking about. And then the parties are going to change again in about 10 years when Jackson runs, and we're going to end up with the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So just understand these two factions, and understand that these two political parties, as they were back then, as they were during the Constitution, it's the same divide right now. It's like, how much government interference do we want in our life? Versus none at all. And there's all sorts of hypocritical stuff going on in that, which we won't get into. So let's get back into the history. Cool chapter because, all right, we finished the Constitution and this government is in place, but it really has to figure everything out. I mean, in the 1800s, early 1800s, there weren't any Supreme Court cases yet. I mean, none of the controversies and things that we think about today were figured out yet. Plus, there's a heck of a lot going on. The Native Americans are still all over, the Midwest, and you also have the country only went as far as the Mississippi River because there wasn't a Louisiana Purchase yet, but there will be soon in this chapter. So the country was small, and it had a lot of other problems. And then slavery, of course, the biggest problem in the South, and manufacturing in the North. So you have sectionalism, and you have all these other things going on. So it is an exciting time. And one of the things I like about this story is, and we'll just kind of get back into it again. If you remember the difference between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, and I talked about that in the last chapter, again, has to do with these political parties. Hamilton is the Federalist, and he wants to encourage commercial growth and manufacturing, and really build the economy of the country so the country can stand on its own. And Thomas Jefferson was totally against all that. He didn't like the factory idea. He didn't like industrialization. He knew what was going on in England, and which was right in the throes of the Industrial Revolution at that time. And Jefferson said, we don't want the United States to be a manufacturing center because it brings urbanization and it brings slums and it brings a working class. And Jefferson didn't want anything to do with that. Jefferson's vision was really this sort of pastoral, rural farming nation where everyone had their own farm, they did their own thing, and he felt that agriculture and farming was a very noble life, and it also fulfilled his desire for liberty and freedom. That if you live on a farm, you can grow what you want, you can sell it where you want, you can do whatever you want. So that's Jefferson, and Hamilton on the other side, and when Jefferson is elected, so Jefferson's elected to be the third president after John Adams, and even though he's really a small government guy. Jefferson is very compromising, if you will, and even though the political campaigns back then were brutal, they compromised once they were in office. So Jefferson was the leader of the Democratic Republicans. So again, he envisioned this agrarian economy based on farms and based on independent small businesses, and that's what he liked. And he said something really cool during his inaugural speech. He said, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. This idea that even though we come from different political parties, we're all Americans. We're all part of this American community. And so even though politics was brutal back then, these guys, for the most part, sort of deferred to their interest. And because of that, that's one of the reasons that slavery was never addressed back then, because there were always these compromises between Southern senators and Northern senators, and that's why slavery really hung around. That's why slavery wasn't. That's why there was no ban of slavery written into the Constitution, because that was something they couldn't compromise over. So hopefully that kind of sets the tone for you. So Jefferson comes into office, and you have these same debates over freedom of religion, and you have a lot of partisan politics growing, which means party divided politics, and just like today, there's newspapers back then, and they were either aligned with the Federalist or the Democratic Republicans. So it's like Fox versus MSNBC. You have a lot of media tie-in with political parties, no different really than it is today. So a lot of that stuff was going on, but because the Supreme Court was brand new, and the entire government, the Senate, the executive branch, they didn't really know what role the Supreme Court was going to play, and turns out that the Supreme Court becomes really strong, and then all of a sudden there are debates, especially from the Democratic Republicans, over the federal judicial system. Is it fair? Because it's super undemocratic, because federal judges are not elected. So that's a big problem with Thomas Jefferson, that today we still have that same issue. Whoever holds the power in office appoints the federal judges. So, but nothing changed there. But kind of a good background story. But the point is, a lot of these things are being worked out now. At the same time, all of a sudden, the country starts to expand, and I don't know if we talked about it or not, but west of the Mississippi was all owned by France back then, the Louisiana Territory, and it's a huge area going all the way up to today's Canadian border, all the way down the Mississippi River. So all of these Midwest states, but especially Louisiana, but everything north of there. So you get into Kansas and you get into Nebraska and a little bit of Iowa. I'm trying to think of some of the other. So the Dakotas now, some of Minnesota. I mean, it's a huge area. So the Louisiana Purchase happens when basically France needs money, and Jefferson's in office, and one of our ambassadors in Paris, discusses this whole deal with Napoleon, and Napoleon needs money, and they basically kind of want to get out of North America at this point. So Napoleon sells the Louisiana Purchase to the U.S. for like 15 million. I mean, it was a steal. So now the U.S., it's not sea to shining sea yet, but it's gotten a lot bigger all of a sudden. And so westward expansion is going to be a thing. And to get ahead of myself with westward expansion, the Native American issue, and then the issue of whether or not slavery should extend to new states is going to come up, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But the point is that the Louisiana Purchase is a really big deal. So it's important because without the Louisiana Purchase, the country would still be, all here in the East. And the year of the Louisiana Purchase, I just looked it up, and I think it's 1803. Sorry, but anyway, there's a quiz question on it, and it doesn't ask for the date, but it asked what comes first, the Louisiana Purchase or something else that I'll talk about, so you can listen. So that's the other part of the chapter, this notion of this new government working out political parties, and I just talked about continental expansion and the Louisiana Purchase. Huge deal, ginormous, as they say. Lewis and Clark expedition comes along, so Lewis and Clark take off, and it takes them years to get out west, and they're trying to find this passage to, I don't know, China or the Pacific. They didn't really know either. But so that's a big deal, and there's a little bit in the book about it, so you can read about that. And I've driven out west like many times and have taken some of those similar routes to Lewis and Clark along the Missouri River, and it's pretty cool. And without modern transportation, you can understand why it took them like several years to get to wherever it is they ended up. So read about that. That's cool. But the other thing that Lewis and Clark opens up is all of this land out west and Native Americans all the way through. So now, as the country gets bigger, the country is encroaching upon more tribes and more territory, and so that obviously is going to get ugly at some point. The other big thing is, now that the U.S. is a nation after after the 1780s and the Constitution, after the U.S. is like an official nation, where do they stand internationally? And it's hard for us to envision international trade during a time where there's no modern communications or no modern transportation whatsoever. Basically, just a bunch of wooden boats is all we're talking about here with sails. So, how does this trade all happen? But it does happen, and it's international trade for the young United States is like the most important thing in the world because what are they doing? They're growing cotton in the South, so they have to have markets for cotton, which is typically England. So there's that part, and there's still a little bit of a slave trade going on, but that's going to become illegal in 1808. But the slave trade is still happening, and there are other things that the country is selling. So cotton, tobacco, cotton, we mentioned that. Some fabric, because there was some fabric being manufactured early here, but not that much. So the point is that neutrality of the seas was really important because, without open oceans, you can't have global commerce because, the British had a great navy. They could have just sat off the coast of the U.S. and blasted ships all day long, and it would have totally killed the international markets for the United States. The point being that international trade is really important to the young U.S. because everything it does is for export. I mean, there's only a very small internal market here in the U.S. at that time because there wasn't that many people. So the British and the U.S. were always having arguments, if you will, over trade. And the other thing that was happening was that the British had a habit of commandeering U.S. ships to search for British soldiers which were trying to escape from the U.S. or other British nationals. And so what would happen is something called impressment. And you'll read about it in the book. You don't have to remember it, but it's kind of cool. Well, not for the people involved, but the British would stop U.S. ships and basically start to take guys off the ships and like forcibly draft them into the English military. So that impressment was happening all the time. There were all sorts of U.S. English sea battles right off the coast of the U.S., Norfolk and those areas. And then you'll read about, here's an example, you'll read about something called the Chesapeake Affair, where the Brits, again, they seize one of our ships, they search it, there's a big fight, a bunch of soldiers get killed, and that exacerbates tensions between the U.S. and England. And we're in the 1806, 1807, 1808, that area, and soon we're going to talk about the War of 1812, and these are all things that start to increase tensions internationally, specifically between Britain and the U.S., and really lead to the War of 1812, which we're going to get to in a minute. The other part in this section of the nation in the orbit of Europe, there's a couple of interesting things here and a couple of things that are ironic here. And somewhere in here, let me just look in my notes because I thought it was kind of cool, but maybe I didn't put it in. No, maybe I didn't put it in. But I mean, one of the things you'll read about is the U.S.'s war in Tripoli. And so, that's on the northern coast of Africa. And, that happens really early, too. So the U.S., they were not going to be screwed around when it came to commerce. And so somewhere in the book, there's a note about the shores of Tripoli, which is in the Marine anthem or whatever that anthem is, and that's where it comes from, so that's kind of fun. Anyway, so the other thing to note in this section, though, which is 8.3 in Mind Tap, is the international slave trade ends in 1808. So I just want to take a minute to talk about that. So, and that was in the Constitution. That was as much as could be compromised between North and South. But this idea that the slave trade was going to end in 1808, all that means is that in 1808 it was illegal to buy slaves from Africa as part of these slave ships. Okay, so the international slave trade was ending, but slavery by no means was ending, and a lot of black marketeers, if you will, continued to sell slaves in the U.S. They would just sort of sneak in. But 1808, the end of slavery, or the end of the slave trade, but not the end of slavery. So I don't think that's on the quiz, so you don't really have to worry about it. But I think it's important to know because it indicates that there's definitely an impulse in the country to end this practice of slavery, and the best that the Continental Congress and the framers of the Constitution could do was to say, okay, at some point in time, we're going to stop the slave trade. Now, it made actually slavery a lot worse because then all of the slaves that were already here, the women very much became exploited because, every time they had a baby, it was worth a lot of money to slaveholders. So this internal slave trade happened, and actually the number of slaves grew exponentially after 1808. So it really didn't matter, but at least understand that's what happened, because I think there's always a lot of confusion about that. So there's that, and then as part of that is also you see the growth of abolition movements, and you have to know what abolition is, or abolitionist, and those were people against slavery. So when I talk about abolitionist, I'm talking about people against slavery, typically in the antebellum era. That's a fancy word that means before the Civil War. So if I say antebellum or you read it, it just means the period of time before the Civil War. I am at 17 minutes in the lecture, and I'm going to keep going because there's a lot to say here. So I apologize in advance, but we're getting there, instead of breaking it into 2 videos. But if you want to take a pause, this would be a really good time, and then come on back and pick up where you left off. And I think I'm going to get a drink. So the next thing I want to talk about is the War of 1812. The first, that's not on the test, like what year did it start, but it did start in 1812. But basically, the takeaways from that for you, the war was between England and the U.S., and there were a lot of hostilities brewing between the U.K. and the U.S. We talked about the Chesapeake Affair, for example. So the Brits were still in North America at some forts, and the U.S. sort of had its eye on Canada, thinking that they'd want to kind of steal Canada from the Brits. So there were a lot of tensions and a lot of things that happened, and so the U.S. declares war, and it's very controversial and unpopular. And the Brits come over and basically, hey, they burned down the White House. So they were a powerful fighting force. The U.S. Army was just totally unprepared. I think there were like 81 officers in the U.S. Army during the War of 1812 fighting the superpower of the era, Britain. So it was really a disaster for the U.S., in one way, but in another way it wasn't, because the U.S. basically won, and the Treaty of Ghent you'll read about was sort of the ending part of it, and England was basically gone. They were out of the country after that. But the thing is that's ironic, after the War of 1812 and a little bit before of the War of 1812, you'll read about something called the Embargo Act, which was a Jefferson thing to not let Britain ship anything into the U.S. anymore, and vice versa. So you'll read about that, and then you'll read about how trade was interrupted by the War of 1812. But the irony here is that Thomas Jefferson, who is totally against industrialization, he's the one who signed off on the Embargo Act, and he was the one that was interested, in the Louisiana Purchase, and so really because of the Embargo Act and the War of 1812, industrialization soared in this country, because as soon as you cut off England as being your supplier, people start making stuff here. So even though Jefferson was the one who didn't want industry here, he was the one responsible for starting industrialization, and he knew it too. And he commented afterwards to actually DuPont of DuPont chemical fame, and I was reading the letters once, that Jefferson feared that he had unleashed a giant force of capitalism and industrialization in the country, and certainly he did, and this all happens around the War of 1812. The takeaway from the War of 1812, and this is on the quiz, the book talks about trends that resulted from the War of 1812, and certainly I just talked about industrialization takes off, so that's one of the trends. Slavery becomes more entrenched, so that's another trend as a result of the War of 1812. And then the country is going to expand west, so that's sort of the other trend. Know those, that's on the quiz. Early industrialization is the next section, and anything big there? Not really, just I guess the 2 points I'd like to make, and I teach a business class, a history class, but it's a history of American business, and actually it's History 3380, and I'm teaching it in the spring, so if you want to sign up, cool, but we'll talk about stuff like early industrialization, and as in our text for this class, the book talks about manufacturing in the country as being all about artisans and craftspeople, and I think you know what I mean there, the Etsy's of the world, the one-offs. There wasn't a manufacturing base in the country, so most of the country and most of the commerce was either farming or craftspeople and artisans making things. So just plant that in the back of your head, because when we get into industrialization a little bit later, all that's going to go away as the nation mechanizes. So that's one thing. But the other point is that industrialization in the Midwest, or in the North, I'm sorry, was really tied to slavery. So there's another irony there, that the North was generally abolitionist and they weren't pro-slavery, but at the same time they were making a ton of money on slavery, because cotton that slaves grew was being shipped up north and was being processed by textile mills, particularly in Lowell, Massachusetts, and everyone was making a ton of money. So anyone who wasn't supporting slavery but was buying slave-made products was really being hypocritical. And there were even some stores that popped up that were, slave-free stuff. So, pretty cool detail going on. And then finally, the book talks about something called sectionalism and nationalism. All sectionalism means is that two groups in different sections or different geographies are against each other. In this case, it's the North and the South. So because of slavery, after the War of 1812, after the Louisiana Purchase, the country's moving west, and now we have all these questions about what's going to happen to slavery. So some of you have probably heard of the Missouri Compromise, which obviously came after the Louisiana Purchase, and the Missouri Compromise is the first attempt to maintain a balance between slave states and free states. So at that time, there were 12 senators from each party, 12 southern senators, 12 northern senators, so there was this balance in the Senate as far as the legality and legislation of slavery. And as new states came online, Missouri in particular, there were debates over, okay, what's going to happen here? Are the slave states going to get an advantage in the Senate? If so, that would be a disaster. So the Missouri Compromise was really sort of the first attempt for the government to say, all right, we're going to keep things even, but it certainly wasn't sustainable. But the end of the story is that they decided in the Senate that Missouri could come into the Union as a slave state, but Maine was created out of Massachusetts, and it was going to be a free state, so now the Senate remained balanced. And we're going to read a lot more about the Missouri Compromise, and that's followed with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and there's a whole bunch of stuff. But just to understand what sectionalism is. And then the other thing I really like in the book, it asked about how the government encouraged a commercial economy. And I think that's important because, we're a capitalist country, and the government's always favored corporations. And I mean, you can have an opinion about that, whether it's good or bad, but they certainly do today also. But I thought it was an interesting point that, the government always encouraged business or commercial economy. And some of the ways they did that were by establishing a post office, by establishing patent laws which encourage innovation, by establishing corporate laws and creating this idea of limited liability. And that's what corporations are. So, people that own stock in a corporation aren't liable for lawsuits and other things that the corporation is involved in, and that really encourages commercial activity because it makes the upside of corporate life, the profitability, much greater than the downside if there's a limited liability situation, because you can make all the money in the world, but you're not going to be punished for bad corporate behavior. So that's sort of the way the government is setting up as far as encouraging commercialism, which you would expect in this country, and that's fine because we're a capitalist market-based country, and the country was built on that. So sorry I went 27 and some minutes. I hope you hung in there, but it's a good chapter. It's a great story, and I hope you get a lot out of it, and be safe. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.